Okay, so in Romans chapter 8, we started looking at the chapter and making connections there to chapter 7. As we open up the chapter, he talks about the law of the Spirit versus the law of sin and death. And as we look backwards, we see that the law of Moses is what's connected to sin and death versus the law of the Spirit, which is the contrasting law through Jesus Christ that Paul has been developing all through the text. The other thing that we noticed is that the flesh has been associated with the old law, and their particular attachment and their particular sort of way that they related to God through the law was through the flesh, and contrasting that, of course, with the Spirit. And so we left off right about verses 11 or 12. In verse 12 it says, "So then, brethren, we are under obligation not to the flesh to live according to the flesh." So he starts off this paragraph, if that is a suitable place to break the paragraph, and I think it probably is. He starts off the paragraph by talking about us being in debt. Now that's generally, when we talk about debt, what are we usually associating that with? From a biblical perspective. Right. And in fact, it's not in debt to sin, but it's in debt because of sin, right? But here, the word obligation is the word debt, and some of your translations may use the word debt. We are under obligation, he says, not to the flesh, but to live according to the flesh. For if you're living according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the body. So we're not under obligation to the flesh, but rather we are under obligation or indebted to whom? To the Spirit, who makes us live. And so to speak in that terminology is, I think, difficult. It's difficult for a lot of sort of theological presuppositions that people in the world have because they don't like that obligation or debt terminology when we're talking about our relationship to God. But indeed, he has put us under obligation because of all that he's done for us, which is going to continue to be laid out through the rest of this chapter. Now, contrasting that with sin, why would we, not just speaking of this particular context, but just from the standpoint of the flesh and sin and death, what is the contrast? We're not under debt to that. Why would we not be under debt to sin and death and the flesh versus why we are indebted to God? Why are we indebted to God? Yeah, because he's done all of this for us, right? And so why are we not indebted to sin and the flesh? They've done nothing for us, right? So the idea is that why would you go and serve the one who has done nothing but cause grief and misery and pain versus the one that you're actually obligated to and indebted to, who has done all these wonderful things for you? Now, another aspect of this is what we've talked about in the relationship of grace. People think that in grace you cannot incur an indebtedness, and it's just not true. There is that reciprocal aspect of grace that when somebody has done so much for you, you absolutely feel indebted to them and ought to feel indebted to them. And so he's using that appropriate language right in the context of grace that God has given to us. And what is our response to that grace? Well, it's a very obligated and indebted response. We've talked about that before. We say that sort of thing all the time. I'm so indebted to someone. And it's not, what you don't mean is some burdensome some burdensome relationship like with the bank or something, like they're waiting to foreclose on you. It's rather you feel the constant burden, wholesome burden, happy burden of trying to pay someone back for all that they've done for you. even though in many instances, and certainly in this instance, it's not as if you could, but you still operate under that burden and under that obligation. So I think that that's interesting language to use when we're talking about our relationship to God, and talking about it in the context of what He's done for us. In verse 14, it says, "For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are" what? All right, sons of God. And so what does that mean to be led by the Spirit here? Think about the context and everything we've talked about so far and what God has done for us.
In verse 12, he talks about being dead to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. The other side of that is to live according to the Spirit, but following what the Spirit has laid out for us.
Yeah. So being led by the Spirit is following after what the Spirit, how the Spirit has guided us, right? And nobody thinks, or nobody, maybe I should say nobody. Generally speaking, in the landscape of religious notions, there are many people talking about being led by the devil, or led by the flesh, or led by sin in the same ways that they talk about being led by the Spirit. And so it's a good contrast that Andrew brings up, is here we're talking about, we're talking about both of those things, and they are contrasting things. And so why would somebody, they generally don't talk about some miraculous guidance of the devil or demons or so forth, but then that seems to be all anybody talks about on the other end. But rather, they talk about influence and so forth. And so we're talking about influence. I am influenced by the Spirit. And of course, the Spirit guides us through what He has revealed, through what He has revealed through the writers of Scripture, through inspiration. All right, bringing into that discussion then, in verse 15, "For you have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father." We'll come back to that in just a moment, but it says the Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, so that we may also be glorified with Him. So, from the standpoint of co-testimony, how does the Spirit testify with our spirit? Trevor?
Whenever we follow whatever the Spirit says, that we have His support, that we are sons, because He's laid out what sons look like.
Yeah, and so I like to think of it in legal terminology from the standpoint of testimony. If somebody gives testimony and then they're not physically present at the trial, we call that a deposition, right? That their testimony can be brought in that way. And I've actually used this quite a bit in teaching in Fiji, where people very frequently use that terminology of being led by the Spirit, speaking in tongues, and so forth. And so, as Trevor points out, are you following what the Spirit says? So I might say, what is your testimony about your relationship to God, right? So let's get your testimony on record. We write it down and get that description. I asked them to look at, is this a fair description? Is this your testimony about you being in Christ and what your relationship? Yes. All right, now let's read the Spirit's testimony. And let's see what He says about a relationship with Christ and about being a Christian, being fellow heirs. And let's see if His testimony sounds like your testimony. Let's see if He testifies with you or against you. And so I think, just in plain terms, it's not this mystical thing. The Spirit has testified. And now we come along and we testify. And does our testimony match up? Are we saying the same things that He has said? I really appreciate the language that Tom Holly, I try to use it a lot myself. Let's see if what you're saying looks like what they're saying. Let's see if you say you speak in tongues. Let's see if that's what the Spirit says about speaking in tongues. You say that you become a Christian, and you tell me how you got saved. All right, well, let's see if that's how they got saved. And if it's different, then your testimony comes from somewhere else. It does not come from here. So, are you being led by the flesh? Are you being led by the Spirit? And where is the Spirit leading from? Why, it is leading from the standpoint of the words that he has revealed. And there is not only no evidence that he continues to do that today, direct revelation, but there is a great deal of contrary evidence that he does that today. And so we appeal back to the as I say, the deposition, the testimony that's already been put into the record, as it were. Looking at verse 15, and that received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. I just want to take a moment on this. This came up in a conversation the other day, and so I think it's worthy of note that the term Abba is frequently called upon as a term of childish endearment, intimacy, and so forth. And I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have is when people, they modernize the notion of a child calling affectionately to their father. What I mean by that is throughout most of history, and still throughout most cultures, people do not have disrespectful or flippant or casual terms for their fathers. It just doesn't exist, right? So to take a childlike word that children might use to refer to their parents, Papa, something like that, that has a different connotation throughout history than some of those terms would have in our day and age. Nobody's been calling their dad Pops in the ancient Near East, and Dad in a sort of casual way, but that every word would carry reverence with it. So my point being that people would take this and run with it to the point that we should refer to God in a casual manner. We can refer to him in an intimate manner, but not a casual one. And so this Jesus statement, this quote from Jesus crying out to the Father and showing an intimacy that he has, and then we also have that intimacy, is not to say, let us lower our standards of the nature of how we refer to God. We use Father because in our society that is separated from, I think, more casual usages. I don't know what the affectionate term would be, because I think our culture has destroyed the reverence we have for fathers. And it makes it hard to find a term that combines those two in our culture. It's difficult. But be very careful that we don't take a modern notion and then insert it here and say, oh, it's just like what we would call our dad or pops or whatever. And then people start using that in prayers and so forth, and it's just not appropriate. So anyway, I just thought I'd address that real quick. But we do gain that intimacy, reverent intimacy. All right, any other thoughts on that before we move on to lesson 12, picking up in verse 18? All right, verse 18, when Paul, he introduces sufferings into the conversation at this point. And as we're going along, and he's talking to people who have put on Christ, as we saw in chapter 6, still trying to convince them of the impact of that decision, their relationship to the law as it now stands. All of this, putting on Christ in all the world, but maybe especially in Rome, brings physical consequences. And I say especially in Rome because Rome would be the seat of obviously civil power, but there would have also been a Jewish contingent there. And so from the standpoint of catching it from both sides, you probably couldn't do better than Rome. Maybe Jerusalem would be just as bad and just weighted in the other direction from the Jewish persecution. So they're dealing with persecutions for their decisions to put on Christ. All of this, we have heirs. We've benefited from all of this. And the thought comes to mind, yes, but we are suffering for this. Sure, that's right. We're suffering. But what does Paul give as a perspective to the sufferings?
Glory.
Yes. He says they're not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us. There are a lot of ways to say that. And there are a lot of people who don't want to hear that. Because what they want is for the suffering simply to not be here. That's not on the table. Without abandoning God, certainly. And in fact, even if you do abandon God, Paul has already shown there's sufferings of a different sort awaiting you. So there's sufferings no matter what. The point is, what is at the end of it all? And Paul is saying, on this path, yes, there are also sufferings. But they get you to a place where there are not only no sufferings, but such glory that the sufferings that you deal with now are forgotten. They're so small by comparison. And I think that we not only need to appreciate that, there is a balance. We want to sympathize with people in their suffering. We don't want to be dismissive of people's suffering. And yet there is also a place, and I think increasingly a place in our culture, where all we do is the empathy and never call people to sort of bear up. Bear up under the burdens, bear up under the suffering. And one of the most important ways we have to bear up under the suffering is the very same thing Christ did, which is look to the joy that is set before you. And see the sufferings shrink by comparison. And there are some sufferings that I think sometimes people think this could never be small. Well, if you're not looking at heaven, you're right. They'll only grow and grow until even your small sufferings seem great. But if you just reverse the perspective, and I appreciate so much when people have that perspective, some of the people that I've known that have had that perspective, they are some of the people who have gone through some of the most tragic suffering I can think of. And it is in light of that their perspective as Paul's is highlighted. You just notice it all the more. And you say, I can't imagine. And they'll, look, this is a world of misery and woe, but this is not my home. And maybe because of those deep sufferings, it's forced them even more so to look beyond. And maybe that's part of the problem is we suffer so little that we almost feel like we need to make much of our suffering. But Paul is minimizing their suffering, to use a modern terminology. He's minimizing their suffering in the face of much more tremendous suffering than any of us have ever known. And so that is who he gives this salve to, and it is salve for the one who believes it and hopes in it. So then he says this in verse 19, for the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. Somebody have the King James Version here? Read that section, verses 19 through 22.
For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption
Yeah, it's a peculiar, yet familiar to my ears, translation here, that the King James, and I think it's one of those places where an old usage of a word is not helpful in a modern context. The creature, the creature, the creature. And it's interesting that the King James did choose to put whole creation at the end of that. But I think it's because they would have more broadly used that word as created thing, right? The thing created, which is the meaning of the word. So the New American Standard here and most all translations, I think, have a much more, at least in a modern sense, correct translation there. So it's not talking about some creature over here that's groaning and so forth, but rather the creation, right? The created thing, that is everything. Now, what does Paul mean that it's groaning and looking for relief? How is creation doing that?
Death and decay have reigned since sin entered into the world.
Yeah? All right.
That way, it's longing for that to be removed.
That's right. Trevor?
I was gonna say, it seems like there's two senses of the word here, that there's a sense that's peculiar to Christians, and that they are the ones looking forward to the revelation, this glorious liberty, but yet Christians aren't the only ones suffering. The entire creation itself, the whole creation was brought under the curse.
Yes, and so that's right. So he starts that conversation with our suffering, and it's not worthy to be compared. And really, it's not just us; it is all of creation. And you think about that from the standpoint of Old Testament language. How many times does God say, "The land cries out," right? The blood cries out from the ground, all the way back to Genesis chapter 4, right? So that creation sort of participates in this condemnation of sin. And even God would say, as he brings Israel out of their land and into captivity, he says that the land will have rest. And not just rest from being worked, rest from your sins, from your iniquity, right? So there's a sense in which the creation itself is groaning, and part of that groaning is the whole creation is suffering the result of Genesis chapter 3 and everything that has followed. I also think this, that whole creation groaning is seen throughout history, throughout literature from history. In every culture, in every time span, there are stories shot through of people looking for salvation, looking for something better, looking, in fact, for a Messiah. Almost every culture. We were talking about sci-fi literature, some of us the other day, and how often they use the Messiah as sort of the central part. It's the one is coming. The one of prophecy is coming. And I want to say, because a lot of them are atheists, I want to say, you don't get to use that. You know, that's our story. But I think it's illustrative of what Paul is saying here, that in fact, that is right. Everyone wants the cleansing rain. Everybody wants the time to come where all of this devastation is done away with from the ground on up. And it will come. And God's creation will find relief. And God's people will be a part of the ones finding relief. Now, there will be those who do not find relief. They'll be like the ones who cry for justice, but then don't want it when it actually comes. But the justified are the ones crying out saying, there's got to be something better. And there is. And that's part of the promise here. Sam?
You know, if we didn't have the pain, the suffering, the struggles that we go through here on this earth, why would we want to live?
Right. Right.
In a way, it's an incentive for us to look forward to that time when it will be no more.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The world has become, through the curse, not a hospitable place. It was created to be a hospitable place, but then it's become a not hospitable place. And we must be careful that we do not overstep in trying to make it the hospitable place for us. It is very easy for us to get to levels of comfort here that, as Sam says, would keep us from looking for something better, and keep us from even noticing that groaning that is occurring, and not having anything to do with that groaning. I appreciate, I talked last week when Stan led the song, asking for pain and times of service, that a faithful Christian wants reminders. We want to stay aware of the groaning. Brad?
So going through this book this time, I've really been trying to set aside any preconceived notions, and what we've been talking about today has generally been my understanding of what Paul's language here is getting at. But we struggled to answer this question, Sherry and I, because we were trying to reconcile it with passages like in 2 Peter 3, where he talks about the elements being burned up. So how do you reconcile those two? How can we be certain that Paul is saying what he's saying here when you have a passage like it?
Well, he's talking about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, that's what a lot of people will go with that. I think that is release for the creation, right? The creation is laboring under a burden. It is not doing what it was created to do. In Genesis chapter 1, there's a picture depicted of what's supposed to be. And then after chapter 3, it's broken, right? And so from the standpoint of that, the elements being burned up and so forth, that is a release, right? That's not the creation then being put into torment. That is people, but that's not creation being put into torment. And so I do think that there's harmony with what Peter has to say about what will happen to creation with this groaning and saying, I don't want this anymore, right? It's almost like, even from a worldly perspective, when someone is suffering and they die, the world looks at that and goes, oh, finally. They don't have to deal with that anymore. And I think there's a sense in which creation, from that perspective, it's the same thing. It's creation doesn't, we're personifying a lot of things here, but the world is not in a harmonious place, and it is a groaning and so forth. In that, preached about Christians and creation, I can almost agree with the environmentalists. Yeah, it is. It's a wreck. My point is we can't fix it, right? Not like they think we can. And so I think that's a reasonable harmonization. Anybody else have a thought on that, Trevor?
I think 22 is the only verse in here that is talking about universal creation as a whole. And so I think we've got to be careful that we don't take the blessings that are associated with Christians and transfer that accidentally over to the whole creation. And keeping that in mind, it doesn't say what happens to the mother in verse 22. We don't know if she died in childbirth or what. So the focus on the blessings is the creation, the children being born from this process.
So you think you would take the anxious longing of the creation being the creation in those 3 verses leading up to verse 22 is the Christians that are created through Christ? I have to think about that. I think that is a possibility, obviously, as we're connecting it back to verse 18. All right, so let me ask this, Trevor, just thinking through that. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. So to me, that seems to separate that creation from the sons of God, that creation's waiting for this. So I'd have to try to reconcile that. Maybe we can talk.
I would liken it to the language like we find in Isaiah and a lot of the other prophets, where you have a woman that is set up as the image of God's people that are bringing forth the next generation, but
Okay. All right. Well, you had an answer. That was good. I have to think about that. All right. So coming on down to verse 23 then, not only this, but we also ourselves, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoptions as sons, the redemption of our body. And so just moving through there, obviously, there's a connection there. Here's creation groaning. We're groaning. We want relief. But we've got it, right? This is the relief that we've been looking for, right? So in the context of this creation groaning in verse 22, we ourselves, we're groaning, and we want renewal and this fruit of the Spirit, this adoption as sons. But that's just what he said we had. And so think about that from the perspective of people, again, people who are suffering, who are participating in that groaning, right? And he's saying, but the thing that we're groaning for is already ours. And so don't miss that. Don't forget what you've already taken hold of and what you've already grasped. If they're not careful, they're falling into, I think, that same old trap of the Jews of still looking for something. Somebody who's still looking for that last shoe to drop, maybe that's still looking for that Messiah that they had in mind, that a lot of the world still has in mind, that's going to come and conquer the world and finally set them on the pedestal that they want to be set on. No, you're already adopted as sons. And so the world is groaning, or rather the creation is groaning, and we do too, I understand that, but what is it that we're groaning for? Adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. Now, there is a now but not yet part of this. Verse 24 says, for in hope we have been saved. But hope that is not seen, or rather that is seen, is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it. Briefly here, what is the nature of this hope, and as distinct from the way we sometimes in general conversation use the word hope?
Hope like not likely versus here, it's a sure thing.
Right. He says we wait with perseverance because it's a confident hope, right? It's not a throwing darts or rolling dice or just trying to win the lottery. It is, I know it's going to happen. I'm confident it's going to happen. But it is hope because it hasn't happened yet. That's the only thing that makes it hope, is it hasn't fully been actualized. So this is the now but not yet, right? Paul is saying you already have adoption as sons. So you've already received this. It is already in your possession, as it were. But yes, there is a sense in which we are still waiting. Certainly, we're waiting for that finalization, that ultimate realization of these things at the end of this life. So it's hope, but it's confident hope, and so we wait eagerly and patiently and with perseverance, and so that distinguishes it from the mindset that just hopes it rains tomorrow or something like that, or rather, in my case, hopes it doesn't rain tomorrow. But anyway, how does the Spirit help us in our prayers according to verse 26 and verse 27? He intercedes, all right? It says, in the same way the Spirit also helps our weaknesses. And it says, for we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And He who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because He intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. All right, so there is that intercession. But it says it's interceding because we don't know how to pray as we ought. Well, that's a peculiar thing because Jesus told us how to pray as we ought. So what does this mean? What does Paul mean we don't know how to pray as we ought when we have several places that instruct us how to pray as we ought?
Kind of liken it to having a lawyer in court. We usually let the lawyer do the talking on our behalf because he knows all
Yeah, I like that idea. That there are ways of approaching the bench, as it were, that are best, and we untrained may not know that. I would say a couple of things. First of all, yes, I like that notion of an advocate. I would say, secondly, there are certainly times, and especially in the midst of suffering, where we are uncertain about exactly what to say. And I think it is particularly in those times we come before God in prayer in uncertainty. And this is meant to give us more certainty, that it is not the perfectly worded prayer that God is looking for, that you are coming with the aid of His Spirit. So don't think that, oh man, I've got to make sure I draft this out just right and make sure I've got my legal documentation in order. No, don't. You come to the Father, and the Spirit is right there interceding for you. He's on your side. He's your advocate. Paul?
To that idea of like trying to get just the right words, I like the idea here that it's groaning's too deep for words. It's almost like our language fails us here, that we couldn't even find the right words.
Right.
And even then, He intercedes for us.
Yeah. And I would just say one thing in addition to that. Speaking of the Spirit in terms of revelation, and the Spirit has revealed these things, one of the ways in which I think the Spirit does help us in our groanings is He has revealed those very sorts of prayers. Right? So when we go and we read the psalmists crying out in their suffering, we see what it looks like. And what it looks like is that they don't always have the exact wording that they would like. That there is that difficulty of approaching the throne of God. All right, we'll pick up in verse 28 and wrap up chapter 8 on Wednesday.